What if many of the strangest phenomena of the human mind weren't mysteries, but clear signs that a specific area of the brain has been activated without you realizing it? What if that intense feeling of déjà vu, the sudden, unexplained shiver, or even the strange impression that someone is nearby when you are completely alone weren't coincidences, nor imagination, nor something supernatural, but real manifestations of how your brain constructs reality? Think about it for a moment. Have you ever experienced that moment when everything around you seems absurdly familiar, as if that scene had already happened exactly the same way before? Or that vivid memory that appears out of nowhere, without context, without warning, almost like a fragment of an old movie you don't remember watching? Perhaps you felt a strong emotion, fear, nostalgia, euphoria, without being able to pinpoint a concrete cause. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you imagine. For a long time, these strange brain phenomena were treated as unfathomable mysteries of the human mind. Some people attributed these experiences to chance, others to stress, and still others to spiritual or supernatural explanations. But neuroscience has begun to notice a disturbing pattern. Many of these seemingly unconnected events have something in common. They pass, directly or indirectly, through a specific region of the brain, the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is an area deeply connected to memory, emotion, pattern recognition, and the sense of familiarity. It's where the brain cross-references information about what you feel with what you remember and what you perceive. In other words, it's one of the regions responsible for silently answering the most basic question of all. Does this make sense? When everything works perfectly, you don't even notice this process happening. But when there's a different, subtle, or out-of-sync activation, the conscious experience can take on strange contours. And that's where phenomena like déjà vu, the feeling of presence, memories without a clear origin, and even that uncomfortable feeling that something is out of place, even when everything seems normal, come in. The brain continues trying to organize reality, but for a few moments it sends signals that don't perfectly fit the logic. The result is an intense, striking experience that is often difficult to explain in words. Perhaps you're wondering now, does this mean there's something wrong with me? That's a common, and completely understandable reaction. But the truth is, these experiences are far more common than they seem, and in many cases, they're part of the normal functioning of the human brain. The problem is that almost no one explains this clearly, simply, and accessibly. And when the brain doesn't understand itself, the mind tends to fill in the gaps with fear, doubt, or misinterpretations. What's most fascinating is realizing that the brain doesn't wait for you to authorize these sensations. Many of them happen even before you can rationalize what you're feeling. First comes familiarity, then emotion, then strangeness. Only then does the conscious mind try to find an explanation. And it doesn't always succeed. Have you ever experienced this? Throughout this video, we'll explore how the temporal lobe works behind the scenes of these experiences, why it's so involved in strange brain phenomena, and how small changes in its activity can completely alter the way you perceive the world and yourself. What seems inexplicable may, in fact, be a valuable clue to how the human mind works. So stay with me, because from now on we're going to start entering this territory where science, perception, and estrangement meet. And the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that perhaps the real mystery isn't what we feel, but how the brain creates the sensation of reality that we accept as absolute. And as we delve into this territory where the brain begins to reveal its inner workings, one thing becomes increasingly clear. These experiences that seem so individual, so difficult to explain, are rarely solitary. If at any point in what we've discussed so far you thought, "This has happened to me before," know that this feeling is more common than you imagine. And that's precisely why this space exists. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has resonated with you the most so far. It could be a déjà vu experience, a strange feeling you've never been able to explain, or even a question you've always kept to yourself. When you share, you're not just telling your story, you're helping others realize they're not alone in these experiences either. And if this content is making you see the brain in a different way, liking the video is a simple but powerful way to show that this type of conversation needs to continue. Each like helps this content reach more people who may now be experiencing the exact same sensations you've already felt. Now, if you feel that this type of topic captivates you, provokes you, and makes you reflect, subscribing to the channel is almost a natural step. It's like saying, "I want to continue exploring this." Your subscription isn't just a number. It's a sign that it's worthwhile to continue delving deeper into these mysteries of the human brain, with respect, science, and curiosity. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. That's what transforms a video into a conversation, and a conversation into a community. And from here we begin to delve even deeper into the role of the temporal lobe, understanding why it's so connected to these experiences that defy logic, and why often the brain prefers to make us feel before even letting us understand. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to understand why so many strange experiences seem to arise out of nowhere, we need to look more closely at where it all happens. Literally. The temporal lobe isn't just another part of the brain with a difficult technical name, it's a true backstage of the human mind, a meeting point where memory, emotion, perception, and identity intersect all the time, even when you don't realize it. In simple and visual terms, imagine the brain as a large decision-making and interpretation center. The temporal lobe is located on the sides of the head, more or less at the level of the temples, very close to the regions responsible for hearing, language, and memory. This position is no coincidence. It is there that the brain integrates what you hear, what you feel, what you remember, and what you recognize as familiar. It is there that reality begins to take on meaning. When you look at someone you know and immediately feel that they are part of your history, even before you remember exactly where you know them from, the temporal lobe has already kicked in. When an old song evokes intense emotion and brings back memories you didn't even know you had stored, that same system is working behind the scenes. It doesn't just store information, it gives it meaning. And that changes everything. What's most fascinating is that the temporal lobe doesn't work in isolation. It acts as a bridge. On one side, memory. On the other, emotion. In the middle of all this, the perception of what is happening now. It is this integration that allows you to construct a continuous narrative about who you are, where you are, and what you are experiencing. Without this bridge, the human experience is fragmented. With it, the brain creates the sensation of continuity, of identity, of self. But it is precisely because it is this bridge that the temporal lobe becomes so sensitive. Small variations in its activity can generate enormous impacts on how you perceive the world. A slight delay in communication between memory and perception can create an intense feeling of familiarity without a clear recollection. An emotional trigger out of context can generate fear, nostalgia, or strangeness without apparent cause. The conscious mind tries to keep up, but often arrives late. And here's a hidden truth that few people talk about. The brain wasn't designed to seek absolute truth. It was designed to make quick decisions, create coherence, and keep you functional. The temporal lobe actively participates in this process. It evaluates signals, cross-references incomplete information, and delivers an interpretation that makes sense at that moment, even if that sense isn't entirely accurate. This dynamic has a profound impact on how we interpret our own experiences. When something strange happens, the first reaction is usually to question oneself. Why did I feel that way? Am I exaggerating? Is this normal? The problem is that we rarely learn how the brain really works. Without this knowledge, the mind tries to fill in the gaps with fear, assumptions, or overly harsh judgments. Understanding the role of the temporal lobe changes this mindset. You begin to realize that many of these experiences are not failures, but side effects of an extremely complex system trying to keep everything organized. It's almost like observing the behind the scenes of a major production. When everything works perfectly, you only see the final result. When something goes slightly off rhythm, the behind the scenes becomes visible for a moment. And it is at this moment that strange sensations arise, moments of doubt, perceptions that seem not to fit into logic. The brain continues working, trying to preserve the continuity of the experience, even when the information arrives misaligned. The temporal lobe comes into play as a mediator, trying to maintain the narrative of who you are and what is happening. This understanding also transforms how we view our own mental journey. Instead of fighting against these experiences or immediately labeling them as something negative, you begin to observe them with curiosity. What is the brain trying to do here? What kind of integration happened, or failed to happen, at this specific moment? Throughout life, the temporal lobe participates in virtually all major internal transformations. It helps shape beliefs, reinforce emotional memories, influence decisions, and even sustain the sense of identity over time. It's no exaggeration to say that it plays a silent but decisive role in who you believe yourself to be. And perhaps that's why, when something happens in that region, the experience is so striking. It doesn't seem like just a technical error of the brain. It seems like something personal, profound, almost existential, because it deals precisely with the elements we use to define reality and ourselves. Now that this foundation is becoming clearer, it's possible to see that strange brain phenomena don't arise in a vacuum. They are rooted in very specific processes, in delicate connections, in invisible decisions that the brain makes all the time to maintain the coherence of human experience. The temporal lobe doesn't create mysteries by chance. It creates meaning, even when that meaning seems, at first glance, confusing. And it's precisely here that the conversation begins to take on another layer, because understanding where everything happens opens up space to understand why certain experiences are so intense, so real, and so difficult to ignore. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the temporal lobe merely as an area linked to memory or emotion is still insufficient. What truly makes this region so crucial is the silent role it plays in constructing what you call reality. Without realizing it, your brain is constantly asking fundamental, almost invisible questions, and the temporal lobe directly participates in the answers. Simple questions in form but gigantic in impact. Is this familiar? Is this important? Is this real? These questions don't arise consciously in your mind. They happen behind the scenes in milliseconds while you live, observe, feel, and react. Even before you think about something, the brain is already evaluating signals, comparing them with past memories, cross-referencing associated emotions, and deciding how that experience should be perceived. The temporal lobe functions as an interpretive filter, a translator between the external world and internal experience. When you enter a new environment and yet feel a strange familiarity, this mechanism is already at work. The brain searches for patterns similar to something you've already experienced, even if it doesn't find a clear memory. If it finds enough fragments, the feeling of familiarity appears. Not because you've been there before, but because the brain has decided that it looks like something known. And this decision happens without asking logic for permission. The same applies to the question, is this important? The temporal lobe helps assign emotional weight to experiences. It participates in evaluating what deserves attention, what should be remembered, and what can be ignored. This is why some seemingly simple moments are intensely etched in memory, while others, objectively more relevant, fade from memory. Importance is not defined solely by facts, but by the combination of emotion, context, and perceived meaning. And then comes the most delicate question of all, is this real? Here, things get even more interesting. The brain doesn't verify reality like an impartial judge. It constructs a functional version of it. If sensory, emotional, and mnemonic information is aligned, the experience seems solid, reliable, indisputable. But when this alignment fails, even subtly, a feeling of strangeness arises. This is where many people describe that hard-to-explain feeling, as if something is out of place. Everything seems normal, but it doesn't feel right. The conscious mind tries to find a rational explanation, but it can't. The discomfort doesn't come from an obvious error, but from a malfunction in the mechanism that constructs the sensation of reality. The temporal lobe continues trying to answer the silent questions, but the answers don't fit perfectly. This failure doesn't need to be extreme to have an impact. We're not necessarily talking about rare diseases or conditions. Sometimes, a small delay between perception and memory, a misplaced emotional activation or recognition without a clear reference is enough. The brain does what it always does. It tries to maintain coherence. But this time, coherence seems fragile. Reality loses some of its firmness. And this has a profound effect on the mindset of those who live through these experiences. Because when reality seems strange, the tendency is to doubt oneself. The silent question arises, can I trust what I'm feeling? This doubt is not weakness. It is a direct reflection of perceiving, even without knowing how, that the internal construction of reality has suffered a small crack. The most intriguing thing is that, even when this mechanism malfunctions, the brain doesn't stop. It adjusts, corrects, rebuilds. In a few seconds, everything can return to normal as if nothing had happened. But the feeling remains. That striking impression, almost a brief revelation that reality is not as solid as it seems. That there is a hidden truth in the fact that what you perceive is not a faithful copy of the world, but a highly sophisticated interpretation. Throughout life, this continuous construction shapes decisions, behaviors, and even deep-seated beliefs. What you consider true, safe, or threatening passes through this filter. The temporal lobe actively participates in this journey, influencing choices without you realizing it. It helps define what makes sense, emotionally, even when logic hasn't yet come into play. When something goes wrong in this process, the impact is not merely sensory. It is existential. The person feels that something has changed in the way they perceive the world, even if they cannot explain what. It's as if, for a moment, the inner workings become visible. And seeing the inner workings of one's own mind can be disturbing, but also profoundly transformative. This perspective completely changes how we view strange brain phenomena. They cease to be seen as mere isolated curiosities and begin to be understood as signs of a complex system trying to keep the narrative of reality functioning. The temporal lobe doesn't create illusions on a whim. It creates meaning. And when that meaning falters, the experience becomes strange, intense, and impossible to ignore. The more you understand this mechanism, the more you realize that the reality we live in is, to a large extent, a dynamic construct. It adjusts, corrects, and adapts all the time. And small flaws in this machinery are not rare exceptions, but natural possibilities of an extremely sophisticated system. This does not diminish the human experience. On the contrary, it reveals how fragile, complex, and fascinating it is. This understanding opens the door to a change in perspective. Instead of fear, curiosity. Instead of judgment, observation. Because when you begin to see how the brain responds to these silent questions, it becomes clear that what we call reality is less rigid than it seems, and much more dependent on these invisible inner workings than we usually admit. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because few experiences illustrate the role of the temporal lobe in the construction of reality as well as déjà vu. That intense and almost disconcerting feeling of, I've already lived this, even when you rationally know you haven't. It's not a clear memory, it's not an organized recollection, it's not a flash from the past. It's something more subtle, more slippery, and precisely for that reason so striking. Déjà vu happens at the exact point where familiarity and memory should go hand in hand, but for a moment they become out of sync. Under normal conditions, when you recognize something as familiar, the brain quickly accesses an associated memory. You know where you know that person, that place, that situation from. The temporal lobe helps to make this connection. But in déjà vu, this mechanism works out of sync. The feeling of familiarity arises first, strong and convincing, while the corresponding memory simply doesn't appear. It's as if the brain says, this is familiar, but can't answer the next question. Familiar from where? This momentary glitch creates a perceptual short circuit. The conscious mind steps in trying to explain, but finds insufficient material. The result is this strange, almost hypnotic sensation of reality repeating itself. In everyday life, this often happens in simple situations. A casual conversation, a hallway you've never walked down, a phrase spoken by someone you just met. Everything is new but something sounds old. The brain recognizes patterns similar to past experiences, fragments of similar contexts, emotions already lived. The temporal lobe integrates these signals quickly and triggers familiarity before checking if there is a real memory to support this feeling. And here's an important point. The brain doesn't work with perfect records. It works with probabilities. If the signals are similar enough, it makes decisions. This decision doesn't go through conscious logic. It happens behind the scenes. The temporal lobe evaluates, cross-references information, and delivers a quick verdict. Familiar. Even if it's a false positive. This false positive doesn't mean error in the common sense of the word. It means efficiency taken to the extreme. The brain prefers to recognize something it hasn't experienced rather than fail to recognize something potentially important. This mindset has evolutionary value. Recognizing quickly can be the difference between acting or hesitating. The problem is that, sometimes, this strategy generates disconcerting experiences. Déjà vu, then, is neither a hidden memory nor proof that time has repeated itself. It is the result of an out-of-sync activation in the system that connects memory, emotion, and perception. The temporal lobe signals familiarity, but episodic memory doesn't follow. The mind gets stuck in this gap trying to understand what happened. And it is precisely this interval that makes the experience so intense. It's not just the feeling of repetition, it's the strangeness that comes with it. Something inside you recognizes it, but another part doesn't confirm it. This disagreement creates an emotional impact. Some people describe déjà vu as curious, others as disturbing, others as almost revelatory. It all depends on the interpretation that the mind constructs at that moment. This phenomenon also shows how fragile and dynamic the reality we perceive is. A small misalignment between brain systems is enough for everyday experience to take on a strange tone. The hidden truth here is that the feeling of continuity of life depends on extremely delicate processes. When they work, everything seems solid. When they fail for a second, reality falters. Throughout the mental journey, the brain learns to deal with these events. Most of the time, déjà vu passes quickly. The brain readjusts, logic takes over again, and the experience is filed away as something curious. But the mark remains. Because, for a moment, you had access to the inner workings of your own perception. This experience can transform how you understand your own internal experiences. Instead of seeing déjà vu as something inexplicable or frightening, you begin to see it as a window into how the brain works. A reminder that what we call reality is constructed in real time, from quick and sometimes imperfect decisions. The most interesting thing is to realize that déjà vu is not rare. It's common, especially during times of fatigue, stress, or information overload. In these situations, the synchronization between systems can be slightly compromised. The temporal lobe continues working, but the integration loses precision. The impact is felt in conscious experience. This understanding changes the emotional weight of the phenomenon. Instead of doubt or fear, curiosity arises. What was the brain trying to do at that moment? What patterns did it recognize? What quick decisions were made behind the scenes? Each déjà vu comes to be seen as part of a larger journey of self-knowledge and understanding of the human mind. And the more you reflect on it, the clearer it becomes that familiarity doesn't depend solely on memory. It can exist on its own for a few moments, creating a convincing illusion. The temporal lobe doesn't deliberately lie. It responds based on the information available. When that information is incomplete or arrives out of order, the resulting experience is strange but profoundly human. This is one of the great revelations behind déjà vu. It's not something outside of reality, but a side effect of how the brain constructs meaning. A small mismatch is enough to transform an ordinary moment into something memorable. And this opens up space to understand other, even more complex phenomena that arise when these mechanisms become misaligned in different ways. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a phenomenon that tends to have an even greater impact than déjà vu, precisely because it touches on something very primitive in our human experience: the sensation of presence. That clear, almost physical impression that someone is there with you, even when no one is. It's not exactly seeing, hearing, or touching. It's feeling. And anyone who has experienced it knows how intense, confusing, and difficult to explain this experience can be. In many cases, this feeling arises in ordinary moments. A quiet room, a solitary walk, a moment of distraction. Suddenly, something changes. The body reacts, attention adjusts, the space seems occupied by an invisible presence. The heart may race, breathing changes, the skin becomes more sensitive. All this happens before the conscious mind can formulate any logical thought. When you look around and realize there is no one there, a feeling of strangeness sets in. This phenomenon doesn't arise from nothing. It emerges from the delicate integration between the temporal lobe, emotions, and bodily perception. The human brain is constantly monitoring the environment in search of social cues. Throughout our evolutionary journey, detecting the presence of another being has been a matter of survival. Therefore, the brain prefers to err on the side of excess rather than deficiency. It's better to sense someone who isn't there than to ignore someone who actually is. The temporal lobe is directly involved in this silent surveillance. It integrates emotional information, social memories, and signals from the body itself. When you sense a change in the environment, even a minimal one, this region attempts to interpret what is happening. An undefined sound, a shadow, a change in body posture, or even a specific emotional state can be enough to activate this mechanism. The body also plays a role in this process. Body awareness, called proprioception, tells the brain where you are, how you move, and how you occupy space. When there is a slight discrepancy between this perception and external signals, the brain tries to fill the gap. And that's where the feeling of presence arises. Not as a clear visual hallucination, but as an internal certainty that is difficult to ignore. The brain constructs meaning from fragments. If clear information is lacking, it completes the picture. This is a hidden truth about how we perceive the world. Reality is not merely grasped, it is constructed. And when this construction happens with incomplete pieces, the result can be an inexplicable, yet extremely compelling experience. Many people immediately associate this sensation with fear. Others feel curiosity. Some interpret it as something spiritual. The central point here is not to disqualify any experience, but to understand the mechanism behind it. The emotional impact of the sensation of presence comes precisely from the fact that it activates deep areas linked to identity, security, and social relationships. The temporal lobe helps the brain answer the silent question, am I alone? When the answer is distorted, even for a few seconds, the experience becomes striking. The brain reacts as if someone were there, adjusting attention, posture, and emotion. Only then does logic come into play and try to correct the interpretation. In many cases, the body has already reacted before the mind can calm down. This type of experience reveals how much our perception is a constant negotiation between internal and external signals. There is no button that clearly separates imagination and reality. There is an integrated system that makes quick decisions to keep you functional. The survival mentality is still present, even in safe and modern environments. During times of stress, fatigue, or isolation, this integration can become more fragile. The brain continues trying to protect, anticipate, and interpret. Small noises gain weight. Bodily sensations are amplified. Emotions influence the reading of the environment. The temporal lobe works behind the scenes trying to maintain coherence, but sometimes delivers a response that seems exaggerated or out of context. This experience can also generate a transformation in how you understand yourself. Instead of questioning your sanity, you begin to perceive the sophistication of the system that operates within you. The feeling of presence is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of a brain highly sensitive to the environment, trained to detect social patterns and react quickly. When you understand this, the experience changes meaning. Fear can give way to observation. Confusion can turn into curiosity. Strangeness becomes a brief revelation of the mind's inner workings. For a few moments, you realize that the reality you feel is the result of invisible decisions, made long before consciousness. This understanding also leads us to reflect on how many daily decisions are influenced by signals we don't consciously perceive. The impact of these mechanisms goes far beyond strange experiences. They shape reactions, behaviors, judgments, and even how we interpret others. The journey of understanding the brain is also a journey of understanding ourselves. When the temporal lobe fills in gaps, it's not inventing random stories. It's trying to maintain a continuous and reliable narrative of human experience. Sometimes this narrative deviates from what's expected. And it's precisely in these moments that reality seems to take on a different tone, almost as if something is out of place. The more you delve into this understanding, the clearer it becomes that these experiences are not isolated exceptions. They are part of a complex, sensitive, and profoundly human system. And this sensitivity paves the way for understanding other, even more subtle phenomena that arise when emotion, body, and perception enter into specific states of interaction. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because few things challenge our sense of control as much as the sudden emergence of intense emotions without an apparent reason. Fear that appears out of nowhere, unexpected euphoria in an ordinary moment, or that deep nostalgia that tightens the chest without warning. There was no clear trigger, no conscious memory, no thought that justified it. Yet the body feels it, and it truly feels it. These sudden emotions are often interpreted as something wrong, exaggerated, or even out of context. The person immediately tries to find a logical explanation. Why am I feeling like this? What just happened? This doesn't make sense. But most of the time there is no clear rational answer. And this happens because when these emotions arise, logic hasn't even entered the conversation yet. The temporal lobe is the first thing to take center stage. The temporal lobe has a deep connection with the brain's emotional circuits. It acts as a silent mediator between what you perceive, what you have already experienced, and what your body is feeling now. Unlike rational thought, which is slower and more deliberate, emotional activation happens in milliseconds. Before you even formulate a mental sentence, your body has already reacted. Your heart races, your breathing changes, your internal climate transforms. This happens because the brain wasn't designed to wait for explanations. It was designed to act. In terms of survival, feeling first and thinking later has always been more efficient. The temporal lobe participates directly in this dynamic by integrating emotional memories, internal bodily signals, and environmental perceptions. When this integration activates a specific emotional pattern, the emotion emerges in its entirety, even without an associated conscious reason. That's why someone can feel fear in a safe place, or deep sadness on a seemingly ordinary day. Small, often imperceptible stimuli can activate old emotional memories, not as clear recollections but as internal states. A smell, a tone of voice, a specific light, or even a fleeting thought can be enough to trigger this process behind the scenes. The hidden truth here is that the brain doesn't separate emotion and memory in the way we imagine. Many memories aren't stored as images or stories, but as sensations. The temporal lobe accesses these sensations directly. When something in the present resembles, even vaguely, an emotional context from the past, the brain reacts as if that emotion were still relevant. And this doesn't mean you're consciously reliving the past. It means the emotional system was activated before the rational mind could assess whether it makes sense now. The emotion arises whole, intense, real. Only then does logic try to follow and explain. Often it fails. And this failure generates strangeness. This mechanism explains why some emotions seem disproportionate to the moment. It's not that they are exaggerated. They belong to another context, another layer of experience. The impact occurs because the brain responds based on old patterns, even when the present does not offer a clear justification. Sudden euphoria follows the same principle. Sometimes, a specific combination of stimuli activates a positive emotional state associated with previous experiences. The body responds with lightness, energy, and enthusiasm. The person feels good without knowing exactly why. And, curiously, they rarely question these emotions as much as they question negative ones. Still, the mechanism is the same. Nostalgia also fits this pattern. It's not just remembering the past. It's feeling the past. The temporal lobe integrates emotional and sensory memories so efficiently that the emotion emerges before conscious recollection. When you realize it, you're already enveloped by that feeling, trying to figure out where it came from. This dynamic reveals how much our daily decisions are influenced by emotional states that arise before reflection. Mindset changes, behavior adjusts, and the interpretation of reality transforms. Many choices that seem rational are, in fact, responses to emotions that were already underway. Understanding this is profoundly transformative. Not in the sense of eliminating unexpected emotions, but of changing how you relate to them. Instead of fighting the feeling or judging yourself for it, you begin to see it as a sign of brain activity. Something is being integrated, something has been activated, something is trying to express itself. The temporal lobe doesn't ask if that emotion is appropriate. It asks if it makes sense within some already registered pattern. When the answer is yes, the emotion comes. Simple as that. Logic comes in later, trying to organize the narrative, justify it, contextualize it. Sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes it doesn't. And when you can't, that uncomfortable feeling of experiencing something without knowing why arises. This discomfort is not a flaw. It's an invitation to observation. A reminder that the conscious mind doesn't control everything, and that much of our inner journey happens behind the scenes. These emotions that arise out of nowhere also reveal how complex and rich the human experience is. They show that you are more than conscious thoughts. You are the result of deep layers of memory, emotion, and perception working together all the time. Ignoring this is to miss an important part of self-understanding. When you begin to see these experiences through this lens, something changes. Confusion gives way to curiosity. Fear loses its power. Emotion begins to be seen as information, not as a threat. And this change in mindset has a direct impact on how you deal with your own internal states. The more you understand the role of the temporal lobe in this automatic emotional activation, the clearer it becomes that many of the experiences we call inexplicable are, in fact, extremely human. They are part of a sophisticated, sensitive, and profoundly adaptive system. A system that prioritizes feeling, interpreting, and reacting, even if logic is still trying to keep up. This understanding opens up space to view other brain phenomena with less judgment and more interest. Because when emotion, memory, and perception come into play before consciousness, reality takes on unexpected nuances. And it is precisely in these nuances that important revelations begin to emerge about who we are and how we construct meaning. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point we've talked about experiences that many people have throughout their lives, in a punctual, brief way, almost like flashes. But there's another angle, quieter and less discussed, that helps science understand why all this happens. Not through sensationalism, not through exaggeration, but through careful observation of extreme cases, those in which these experiences cease to be rare and begin to occur much more frequently. In some specific neurological conditions, certain phenomena that appear occasionally for most people become recurrent. Sensations of intense familiarity, sudden emotions, distortions in the perception of reality, experiences of presence, and profound alterations in internal state occur with greater regularity. And it is precisely this repetition that offers science a rare opportunity to observe the inner workings of the brain. When anomalous electrical discharges occur in specific regions, especially in the temporal lobe, the effects are not limited to physical symptoms. The impact appears directly in subjective experience. What was once just a curious event transforms into an observable pattern. And, for researchers, this acts as a kind of magnifying glass on the normal mechanisms of the human mind. The important point here is to understand that the brain functions with electricity. Thoughts, emotions, memories, and perceptions depend on well-synchronized electrical signals. When this synchronization changes, even momentarily, the conscious experience changes. In extreme cases, these alterations are more intense and more frequent, allowing scientists to map with greater precision which regions are involved in each type of experience. It's like watching a gear in slow motion. What normally happens too fast to be perceived begins to leave clear traces. The temporal lobe, in these contexts, reveals how directly it is linked to the sensation of reality, identity, and emotion. When electrical activity in this region intensifies or becomes disorganized, the person's inner world changes in a perceptible way. The most interesting thing is that these observations don't serve to label common experiences as pathological. On the contrary, they help us understand that there is a continuum. The same mechanisms that, in extreme cases, generate intense and frequent experiences are present in all of us. The difference lies in the degree, frequency, and intensity of activation. This is a powerful revelation. It shows that the human brain doesn't have completely separate compartments for the normal and the strange. There's a continuous line of operation. What changes are the conditions under which certain circuits come into play. In extreme situations, the system becomes more visible. In ordinary situations, it operates discreetly, almost invisibly. Science learns a great deal by observing these limits. Not to frighten but to understand. By studying what happens when the temporal lobe is activated intensely and repeatedly, researchers can better understand how it functions when everything is in balance. It's a journey of constant comparison between the extreme and the everyday. These studies also help to dismantle the idea that intense subjective experiences are invented by the mind. When similar patterns repeatedly emerge in specific neurological contexts, it becomes clear that there is a solid physiological basis behind these experiences. Sudden emotions, familiarity without memory, sensations of presence, and alterations in perception do not arise by chance. They follow well-defined pathways in the brain. At the same time, science maintains a cautious stance. There is no interest in turning these phenomena into a spectacle. The focus is on understanding the impact that small variations in brain activity have on human experience. How internal decisions are made. How the sensation of reality is constructed. How identity remains stable, or changes, in the face of these variations. This approach brings about an important shift in mindset. Instead of viewing the brain as a fragile machine that breaks easily, we begin to see it as a highly complex system, capable of operating in different states. Some of these states produce strange experiences, others produce stability. They are all part of the same architecture. The impact of this understanding goes beyond scientific curiosity. It directly touches on how people interpret their own experiences. Knowing that what seems inexplicable is related to observable patterns in the brain reduces fear and increases clarity. The experience ceases to be a threatening enigma and becomes data about how the mind works. There's a hidden truth here worth highlighting. The brain wasn't made to be perfectly stable all the time. It was made to adapt. And adaptation involves experimentation, fine-tuning, and quick responses. Sometimes, these adjustments generate extraordinary experiences. In extreme contexts, they become more evident. In everyday life, they appear as brief distortions. By observing these cases, science also learns about the limits of human perception. What we call reality is not a fixed block. It is a process, a continuous flow of integration between electrical signals, memory, emotion, and the body. When this flow intensifies or reorganizes itself, conscious experience changes. And it is precisely this change that draws the attention of researchers. Not to correct the experiment but to understand it. Each report, each observed pattern, each correlation found helps to better map the inner workings of the mind. The scientific journey, in this sense, is also a journey of humility in the face of the complexity of the human brain. The more we study extreme cases, the clearer it becomes that they are not a world apart. They are an amplification of processes that exist in all of us. The temporal lobe does not behave completely differently under these conditions. It simply reveals, with greater intensity, what normally operates in silence. This understanding creates a natural bridge to further deepen the conversation. Because, if these phenomena help science understand the normal functioning of the brain, then perhaps what we occasionally experience also has much to teach. We simply need to look with attention, curiosity, and less judgment at these experiences that arise when the workings of the mind become a little more visible. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after everything we've seen so far, there's a message that needs to be said clearly, calmly, and responsibly. Strange brain phenomena don't mean there's something wrong with you. They aren't signs of weakness, they aren't indications of loss of control, they aren't proof of madness, and they don't need to be automatically attributed to supernatural explanations. In fact, many times they are exactly the opposite. They are rare windows into understanding how the brain constructs the reality you live every day. The problem is that we grow up with a mindset that associates any out-of-the-ordinary experience with failure. If something deviates from the expected, if we can't explain it quickly, the conclusion is usually harsh and immediate. This isn't normal. This way of thinking creates fear, silence, and isolation. People live through intense experiences, but keep them to themselves, afraid of judgment. And this reinforces the idea that only they go through that, when, in fact, these experiences are much more common than they seem. When you understand how the brain works, this perception begins to transform. What once seemed like a defect starts to be seen as a side effect of a highly sophisticated system. The human brain is not a simple machine that responds only to logical commands. It is a living, dynamic organism that integrates emotion, memory, body, and perception all the time. And, in such a complex system, small variations can generate remarkable experiences. These experiences don't arise because the brain failed, but because it's constantly trying to maintain coherence, continuity, and meaning. The temporal lobe, as we've seen, participates directly in this construction. It helps to make sense of what you feel, perceive, and remember. When this mechanism becomes momentarily visible, the result may seem strange, but that doesn't mean something is broken. There's a hidden truth here that changes everything. The sensation of reality isn't something fixed. It's constructed in real time. The brain is always making quick decisions to answer fundamental questions like, is this safe? Does this make sense? Is this important? Most of these decisions happen outside of conscious awareness. When everything aligns, you feel stability. When something becomes misaligned, even for seconds, the conscious experience changes. The emotional impact of these moments stems precisely from the fact that they touch on something profound, the confidence we have in our own perception. When that confidence wavers, discomfort arises. But this discomfort is not a warning of imminent danger. It is a sign that you have gained access to a process that is normally hidden behind the scenes. Science shows that observing these phenomena with curiosity, rather than fear, generates transformation. The person comes to know themselves better, to understand their own internal states and to deal with them with more balance. Instead of fighting against the experience or trying to suppress it, they learn to observe it, contextualize it, and integrate it into their personal journey. This also changes how we approach decisions and behaviors. Many choices we make are influenced by internal states that arise before logic. When you understand this, you gain more awareness of your reactions. Not to control everything, but to better understand what happens within you. This understanding brings emotional autonomy, not fragility. Strange brain phenomena are often involuntary invitations to reflection. They show that the reality you experience is the result of intense brain activity, not a simple reproduction of the external world. What you perceive as real passes through complex filters, interpretations, and integrations. Realizing this can be disconcerting at first, but also profoundly liberating. Liberating because it removes the burden of judgment. Liberating because it normalizes human experiences that have always existed, but have rarely been explained in an accessible way. Liberating because it replaces fear with understanding. When you understand the mechanism, the experience ceases to be a threat and becomes information. This doesn't mean romanticizing everything or ignoring important contexts. It simply means recognizing that the brain is an adaptive system, and that variations are part of its functioning. Just as the body feels pain, fatigue, or cold, the mind can also produce intense experiences without this representing something wrong. These experiences, when viewed through this lens, take on a new meaning. They become brief revelations about how the mind operates. Small glimpses through which it's possible to see the machinery working. Not always comfortable, but almost always enlightening when understood. And perhaps the most important point of all is realizing that you don't need to label these experiences to validate them. They don't need to be fitted into rigid boxes. They can simply be recognized as part of human complexity. Part of how the brain tirelessly tries to construct meaning. This shift in mindset has a direct impact on how you relate to yourself. Less judgment, more observation. Less fear, more curiosity. Less isolation, more understanding. The journey of understanding the brain is also the journey of accepting that the human experience is, by nature, full of nuances. And when you start looking at these phenomena as windows, and not as flaws, something adjusts internally. The experience remains intense, but it ceases to be threatening. It becomes part of a larger process, a continuous construction of reality that happens every second within you. Write this down. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after exploring all these avenues, memory, emotion, perception, automatic decisions, and the inner workings of the brain, an insight emerges that completely changes how we perceive what we call strange. Perhaps the strange was never a mistake. Perhaps it's simply a rare moment when we perceive the brain working behind the scenes. For most of your life, this mechanism operates in absolute silence. You feel, think, decide, and react without questioning where it all comes from. Reality seems continuous, stable, predictable. There's a comfortable feeling of control, as if the mind were always in command. But, at certain specific moments, something escapes this automatic flow. The curtain moves slightly, and for a second you see the mechanism working. It is precisely in these moments that the experiences we call strange arise. Not because they are abnormal, but because they reveal too much. They expose the process. They show that what we feel as reality is not a solid block, but an active, dynamic construction, deeply dependent on brain function. The impact does not come from the phenomenon itself, but from the shattering of the illusion of transparency. The brain doesn't warn us when it's integrating information, adjusting perceptions, or making invisible decisions. It simply does it, and it does it very well. But when something deviates even slightly from the expected rhythm, conscious experience notices. And this perception is often disconcerting, precisely because we are not used to seeing the inner workings of our own minds. This insight has enormous transformative power. It invites a change of mindset. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is my brain doing right now?" Instead of fear, curiosity. Instead of judgment, investigation. This shift in posture completely changes the relationship you have with your own internal experiences. When you reconsider your experiences through a scientific lens, something reorganizes itself. Déjà vu ceases to be a distressing mystery and becomes a synchronization effect. The feeling of presence stops being a threat and reveals itself as a sensitive surveillance mechanism. Sudden emotions stop seeming like control failures and become automatic activations with deep roots. Everything remains intense but gains context. This shift in perspective doesn't diminish the human experience. On the contrary, it expands it. Understanding that the brain constructs reality in real time makes the journey richer. You begin to realize that what you feel is no less real because it has a neurological explanation. It's more impressive precisely because of that. Knowing how it works doesn't take away the charm. It reveals its complexity. There is also a profound impact on how we deal with decisions. If much of what we feel and perceive happens before logic, then understanding these processes gives us more awareness. Not absolute control but clarity. You begin to recognize internal states, identify emotional patterns, and better understand how certain choices are influenced by invisible processes. This understanding creates space for more self-compassion. Less self-criticism when something deviates from the expected. Less fear of intense internal experiences. More respect for the complexity of the system that operates within you. The brain is not an enemy that needs to be tamed. It is a sophisticated ally, constantly striving to maintain coherence, continuity, and meaning. The great insight, ultimately, is realizing that the strange is not outside of reality. It is within the process that creates reality. It appears when the mechanism becomes visible. When the brain, for a brief instant, ceases to be an invisible narrator and reveals itself as the author of the experience. This invites us to a broader reflection on identity. Who are we after all? Are we just conscious thoughts? Or are we also these deep layers of memory, emotion, and perception working together all the time? When a strange experience happens, it doesn't threaten who you are. It reveals how you function. Reconsidering your own experiences through this scientific lens doesn't mean reducing everything to cold explanations. It means broadening your understanding. It means recognizing that feeling strange is part of the human journey. That the mind is more complex than we like to admit. And that sometimes the most disconcerting moments are also the most revealing. When you start looking at these experiences as signs of brain activity, and not as personal failings, something aligns internally. Reality doesn't become less real. It becomes more interesting, deeper, more honest. You realize that living is, to a large extent, about trusting an invisible system that works tirelessly to give meaning to the world. And perhaps that's exactly what makes these phenomena so striking. They remind us that reality isn't something that simply happens outside of us. It's constructed, interpreted, and felt every second. And, from time to time, the brain allows us to perceive this process happening. This realization doesn't end the conversation. On the contrary, it opens up space to explore even more layers of this silent construction. Because the more you understand behind the scenes, the more questions arise. And it is at this point that curiosity becomes the main driving force of the journey. Write this down. This makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has touched you in some way. Perhaps because you've experienced something similar, perhaps because you've started looking at your own mind with a little more curiosity. If this content has helped you see the brain, and yourself, in a different way, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey with me. Here, the idea is always to go beyond the surface and explore these inner workings of the mind calmly, deeply, and respectfully. If you want, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," or, "This message was for me." I read and follow along, and it helps me understand who's on the other side of this conversation. And if at any point in the video you felt a connection, a like is just a quick gesture to show that this type of content makes sense to you and deserves to continue being produced. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into the idea of how the brain constructs reality without us even realizing it. Click there and continue watching.